Here we have Alexander Volk from Stockholm University, Uppsala University in Sweden. Alexander Volk studies Nordic languages at Stockholm University. He works as a Stockholm guide specializing in LGBT history and the Vikings. Alexander immigrated to Sweden in 1995, and in 2022, he was a speaker at the Queering the City webinar with the Royal Institute of Technology on LGBT issues and urban planning. And the talk Alexander is presenting today is about Stockholm police nicknames for homosexuals in 1883. So the floor is yours. And
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I want to give a special thanks to the Uppsala Name Society, which funded this research, and my professor, Sophia Petersworth Morton. She's the one who got me started on onomastics, which I've really come to love. Okay, this paper is a result of the tours that I do, and it's part of Stockholm LGBT history. The largest raid on homosexuals occurred in 1883 to 1884. And this is the first paper I've written about onomastics. So my quote here is from Pippi Longstocking. I've never tried this before, so I surely will handle it just fine. And to give you guys an idea of the location and where this took place, this is central Stockholm in the picture. To the left, the trees, that's Brazili Park. And this is a quay, it's a Nybro quay. And so let's get going. So the background to this is that Constables C.M. Rosenberg and Carl Saverquist of the Vice Squad were tasked with a surveillance action because of, quote, increased male traffic in Brazili Park in central Stockholm. They started a nightly surveillance from December 19th, 1883 to March 17th, 84. And it's interesting to note they were out every night. That must have been really thankless. They only missed about 3 nights because of weather. And so they were out late at night watching these guys in the park. And their task was to chart the male traffic and take notes and investigate subjects or suspects. And they wrote 53 pages of promemorias and a final report. And the 2 pictures here, an idea of what a constable looked like back in 1910. I think they were in plain clothes, though. And the place that they were focusing on was these urinals that had come from France in 1883. And the design of these urinals, it's an octagon with 8 different stalls, but they're connected. And so this facilitated having sex or meeting someone for sex. And the constables tried to interrogate the loiterers in the park who were MSM, men seeking sex with men. Nobody was arrested during this action. And this is in line historically. Up until about 1900, the police in Sweden did not arrest men caught having sex with other men in general. It was very few arrests. So the onomastics part of this is that repeat visitors who the constables were unable to detain and question were given nicknames to identify them in the reports that they wrote, because they saw repeat visitors. And the constables also, for the men that they actually stopped and questioned, use various bynames, mainly occupational, and this was a form of address back in the 1800s in Sweden. The men were interrogated. They were from varying social backgrounds and ages. And the 2 main groups of these men were civilians and soldier prostitutes, which was a phenomenon that went on in London, Newport, Rhode Island, and Stockholm, Sweden. In Sweden, it went on for a couple of 100 years until 1960. And this is a breakdown of the men that they questioned and identified. So there were 126 civilians in blue here, and then let's see, 61 or was it? Yeah, 61 military men that they stopped. So the purpose and methodology of my paper was to use socio-onomastic tools to evaluate these bynames, nicknames, and name phrases in the report. And this includes semantic categorization and effective categorization, and to evaluate the appellatives and nicknames used for men having sex with men in the text, and to see how homophobic, or if they were homophobic and derogatory, and also to set them in a context with a comparison with references and terminology used in print media around the same time. And I chose the 1870s to the 1920s. I will use sometimes homosexual and MSN interchangeably. And it should be noted that the soldiers were, for the most part, not gay. They were gay for pay. And it's also important to note that we're looking at all of this in terms of LGBT history through a very narrow lens, which is typical for historical research. The only evidence we have, or a lot of the evidence, comes from the criminal justice system, from police reports, and obviously that's a cross-section of men who've committed crimes. So the hierarchy that I used for the bynames was name phrases I consider a part of bynames. Bynames are 1 to 2 words, name phrases more than two words in the name. And the different categories were behavioral, physical, geographic, social status, and occupational. And there was a very specific form of titles for military men, and I called that regimental. And it seemed to be something that was used in the 1800s, and it got confirmation from the Swedish Defense Ministry that they used to use these very formal ways of address. And hypocorisms, as I understand it in English, those are diminutives like John and Johnny, and those were not a part of the study, but there's something that I wanted to note are a byname and not a name phrase. And then here are the actual names. And so the first 4 sections here, the first 4 rows, are the names that the constables gave, these nicknames. And the last section, occupation names, those are the names that they gave to the men that they interviewed. They were based on the information that the men had to give them. And I thought that these were interesting. What I found most surprising is that they came up with these nicknames, and it's not really homophobic. The language in the reports is not terribly homophobic or derogatory. So I guess it's understandable and kind of obvious that they based most of it on physical characteristics: gray beard, long beard, red beard, goatee, crook leg, hawk nose, old man, respec, and horsehead. And then behavioral, the runner, and that was a man who kept on running away from them. They could never track him down. And then there was geographic, the Dane, that must have come from them overhearing and hearing that he was, listening to him and hearing that he was Danish. And another geographic one, this doesn't quite work in English, but it works in Swedish with the grammar, the one from Falun known by R, which is Constable Rosenberg. And the last one is social status, and that is criminal peel blood. That's possibly a little bit homophobic. It could reference a criminal history having to do with sex crimes. And then these occupational ones, these were pretty interesting cross-section, and they show a development from the Middle Ages onward. These are getting a little more simplified from earlier times in Sweden, but barber, surgeon, Tallinn, railway worker, Pillblad, journalist Co, who was an American that worked at the embassy actually, former Mater D, Wilhelm Hellström, and then moving a little bit further down, Vice Corporal 3rd, this is the 3rd from the bottom, Vice Corporal 3rd Squadron Cavalryman number 27 Johansson and Sverigard of the fourth company, number 3 Pettersson. And so workers often had, and military men had numbers. And that's the regimental names that I consider to be their own subset. We have a whole history here in Sweden of 1600s, and 1800s soldier names. And one of the problems here in Sweden is that everybody was called Jonsson or Johansson. And we have a law encouraging and a policy to encourage people to change their last names. And when you got people in the military, they often were given names like hill or lake or nature names, so that they would not, everybody would be Johansson. So the nicknames that the constables came up for, I decided to evaluate these with effective evaluation. And so positive, neutral, and negative. And this is pretty self-explanatory, I think. The physical characteristics are generally neutral, as are the geographic and the behavioral. And the negative ones, it's a little bit of horsehead, hawk nose, crook leg, criminal peelblad. These are not the most flattering things to give somebody as a nickname, but not so offensive, really. And then within the reports, the constables had their own categorizations, and these are appellatives, so classes of nouns and kind of classes of people. And they used these descriptive terms to categorize the men that they saw and that they interviewed. And in Sweden, the police would divide people into 8 classes, social classes, 1 through 8, and that was lower class up into upper class. And that fits here a little bit. Now, these terms, help seeker, gentleman, well-dressed, older, and fat, these are referring to the men who would be out for sex and willing to pay for sex. And then helper, lower class, and younger are the men that were offering sex. I find this term help seeker for a John and a helper is a prostitute really quite charming. It's a very harmless euphemism, and I'd love to know where it came from. But I thought it was funny that the police were using such a gentle euphemism, I guess. And we can see the breakdown of the men who they saw. They saw a total of 187 men in the park who were unique individuals, and then there were lots of repeats. So these categories are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Sometimes somebody would be called younger and lower class, or a gentleman and well-dressed, and older, or things like that. So now, comparing the references and the terminology in the reports with the print media of the time, and also common usage. And I got these all from historical sources. The police reports had helper and help seeker, and then fornicator and sodomite were also found in the report. And then we've got the nicknames that they used for people. And these are relatively okay terms. I think back in the 1800s, you would refer to a gay man or a man that had sex with another man as a fornicator or a sodomite. Those were the only terms they had. They did not use the word homosexual, and that's because that word came into Swedish first in 1886. And was coined by Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin, who had the first gay rights organization, the Humanitarian Scientific Society, I believe. So in print media, you find references to gay behavior was very sensationalistic. And we had a couple of different, in the 10s, And then in the 30s, we had these like kind of gay panics. And they would refer to things like dirty traffic, obscene, unnatural proclivities, faggot, sissy, gay, pathologically changed, sexual abnormalities, pederasts, which is particularly offensive. It's a very tired cliche that gay men like to have sex with children, scoundrels. And then in common usage, gay men would be called perverse, abnormal, woman haters, butt boys, deviants, one of those. And amongst themselves, they would use terms like Ganymedes and garçons. And garçons is a reference to waiters at restaurants who sometimes were escorts. So they were sometimes sexually available. There was one famous restaurant here in Stockholm where all of the waiters had numbers, and then there would be reviews of them, kind of like a TripAdvisor in the bathroom. Now, I couldn't help but draw some parallels to something interesting in British history, and that is the Wolfenden Report on homosexuals and prostitutes. And the government in Britain commissioned this report in 1957, and they were supposed to investigate the situation for homosexuals and prostitutes and come with some recommendations for the laws. So as not to offend the ladies in the room who were part of the commission and the secretaries who were there, female secretaries, Wolfenden decided that they should call homosexuals Huntleys and prostitutes Palmers after, and this is named after the Huntley and Palmer biscuits. And that kind of euphemism I thought was funny, and also compared a parallel with this help seekers and helpers. So to summarize, and the conclusion, I found this to be an interesting insight into the bynames and nicknames of the 1880s and the workings of the Stockholm police. The nicknames had either neutral or negative affective value. And it makes sense that most of the nicknames are based on physical descriptions and facial hair. And police work, they're taught how to take a description and no description of a suspect. And then it was surprising to me that the language and the appellatives and the bynames are not more offensive and not really homophobic. I expected more derogatory terms and bias. I think around the world, the police do not have a great track record with the way that they've treated the LGBT community, but it's better today in many places. And so the questions I had was, why didn't they have any nicknames for the soldiers? That maybe had something to do with that soldiers were easily identifiable because there was, up until 1960 in Sweden and in Stockholm, members of the military had to wear their uniforms at all times. And I'd like to know who coined these terms, helper and help seeker. And then we've got one minute left, so I'll add the epilogue. So it's historically interesting that this report confirms that before the 20th century, gay men were not persecuted or prosecuted so much by police departments. And a few decades later, in fact, the Stockholm police called in Parliament, they called on Parliament to decriminalize homosexuality. And that is paragraph 1810 from 1864. Because they said the situation for homosexuals was sad, and that these men were subject to a great deal and very vulnerable to blackmail. And then I've got a graph here of Stockholm, and this also can be seen even better with prosecutions in all of Sweden. But you can see up until decriminalization in 1944, there was a serious rise. This graph is 1925 to 1944. And it's really starting about 1900. And a theory about why this happened is that population in the 1880s crossed 300,000 people in Stockholm. And there's some theories that that is enough to get a gay subculture, so that people started to prick up their ears and notice this subculture. And then to finish off, historically, it fascinates me, Sweden has always been one of the better places to live if you are an LGBT person. Other countries in Europe burned gay men at the stake. That really didn't happen in Sweden. And that's, by the way, where we get the word faggot, we believe, a bundle of sticks used to burn a witch or a gay man at the stake. And then, and the laws here have been very progressive. In the 18 and early 1900s, Sweden was known as a great destination with the open air male baths for gay travelers. And lots of Germans who were gay came here. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to your questions, and I will stop the screen share. So did that work?
Yeah, thank you. That worked perfectly, and that was very, very interesting. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the floor? So either in the chat or there is a question here from Alexa Prince. Sorry if this was already covered and I missed it, but why use the nicknames instead of just the legal names of the people involved? Was the use of nicknames in this way normal for all genres of crime, or just for MSM?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. I did cover this, but maybe it got lost. While the police were surveilling these men, some men they were able to detain easily, and then they got questioned, and all their details were taken down, where they worked, how old they were, where they lived. But the nicknames like Crook Leg and Redbeard, these were nicknames given to the men that they did not manage to detain. And so they had to give them, they'd see them repeatedly, and so they started giving them names like, we saw Redbeard again tonight. And there were many references in the text to, we saw the guy who was here on January 17th. I guess they just gave them after or based on physical descriptions. So it was the men that they wanted to identify in the report, but they didn't have a name for.
Thank you. There is a question from Cleveland. Cleve Evans.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. A couple of things. First, until I retired a couple of years ago, I taught human sexuality as a psychology professor for years. And I think the more positive attitude toward gay people in Sweden may have been related to the general attitudes toward sexuality and sexual behavior in Scandinavian culture compared to the rest of Europe. I know that, for instance, the importance of a woman being a virgin at marriage sort of within Western Europe goes from the absolutely important in southern Spain to in Sweden, even 200-300 years ago, it wasn't that big an issue, you know, and then a very high percentage of Scandinavian brides in the 19th century, if you look at the records, were pregnant, you know, or had already had their first child with the man they were marrying, you know, again, compared to Southern Europe, you know. So sexuality in general in Scandinavia, I think, has been more thought of as a more matter-of-fact biological thing, you know, than in Southern Europe. And the other thing, I mean, I you know, sort of hate to tell you, but I believe that faggot etymology is an old wives' tale. I think there is no real evidence that the term faggot came from people being burned at the stake. And, you know, I'll try to look up the reference to that and send it to you. But, you know, that's one of those political things that somebody came up with and everybody repeated, but isn't really true. But anyway, thanks a lot for your presentation. So.
Okay, so there was no question.
That
Oh,
was my-
well, just, unless you have a comment on whether you think that's true about heterosexuality also in Sweden, in your experience.
Yes, it is, it's quite sexually liberal here. And that's especially something that came in the 1900s. There was a government agency for sex education. There's also a government agency since the 80s for gay rights. I mean, a publicly funded organization. And yeah, things were quite liberalized. And RFSU is the one that is for sex education. And early on in the 20s and 30s, Sweden started working towards equality. Jämställdhet, equality between the sexes, is extremely important here. It's the Swedish ethos, I would say. And that involves having control of your own body. So that's, I mean, it's a long tradition of that.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, here, well, that's a quote, that's a comment, sorry. That's from Ann Anderson. Love the Pippi Longstocking quote. Thank you for the presentation. And well, if I may, well, there is a question, a comment, sorry, from Ernesto Cuba. Thanks for the presentation. What are your thoughts about the terms helper and help seeker? Is there any other use of the word help when talking about sexuality in Sweden? Is it a metaphor implied?
I really couldn't comment because I mean, I only found this word used in this report. And I'm not sure who coined it or where it came from. I'd love to know. And I mean, I guess it's just a euphemism for prostitution, for Johns and for prostitutes. Other than that, I am not sure. I don't know of any, let's say, heterosexual parallels.
There's a question from Gerrit. So.
Yes, thank you. I just wondered, graybeard, there may be many graybeards. So how, because beards were there for many, was fashion. How unique are these names? So do they really identify individuals rather than group or whatever?
So I don't understand your question. What you mean, the appellatives, or you mean the nicknames?
Well, yeah, well, you may call someone a graybeard, but there may be 10 graybeards around.
Oh, true.
So
No.
how unique is that that word?
From the context of the reports, I could definitely say that was one person who was called Graybeard. And so I guess that differentiated him from most of the other men. And that's the identifier they would use. And I mean, they would write things, Joe Coe showed up 4 times during their surveillance. Graybeard, I think, might have been 7 or 8 times. So they were always referring to the same person. And they would use that until they found out what their name was, when they were able to stop them and take them down for questioning.
I was just wondering, do you have like data or sources about names that gay men used among themselves? So like nicknames, I know that that's a completely different story, but I was just wondering now.
Yeah, the Ganymedes and Garçon were some of the names. And then later on in the 1900s, there's a whole, this is what I'm hoping to do later with research and working. Gay men would give themselves female names. There were also linguistic codes for identifying each other. Today we use the word berg and queer. And berg used to be like, that was a derogatory term that's been reclaimed. The word for lesbian is flotta, and that's also been reclaimed. But there were other terms, and the 1800s. Oh, and also one of those. That was one of the euphemisms to talk about somebody who's gay. And they would also say things like, I belong to the family.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was, again, very interesting presentation, and also the discussion, I think, was very good and lively. So thank you, everybody.